Growing up on the edge of a dense woodland, the forest was my backyard playground. As a child, I explored every nook and cranny, every hidden glade and secret path, until the trees and shadows felt like old friends. But there was one night, just a few years ago, when everything I thought I knew about those woods was turned upside down. It was late autumn, the time of year when the days are swallowed quickly by the night, and the air carries a chill that seeps into your bones. I decided to take a walk, something I had done 1,000 times before, to clear my head and enjoy the eerie beauty of the forest as it prepared for winter. The path I chose was familiar, well trodden by my own boots over the years. As I walked, a thick fog began to roll in, unusual for that time of evening. It slithered between the trees like a living thing, obscuring the path and distorting the shapes of the forest into grotesque figures. The air grew colder, and a deep, unsettling silence fell over the woods. All I could hear was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the quickening beat of my own heart. That's when the whispers started. Soft and indistinct at first, they seemed to come from all around me, as though the fog itself had found a voice. I stopped, straining to listen, to catch some thread of sense in the murmurs. But there was nothing, just a soft babble, like a crowded room heard through thick glass. Unease pricked at the back of my neck, urging me to turn back, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could almost catch words now, phrases that tugged at the edges of understanding. "Leave," one seemed to say, a hissing sigh that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "Gone," said another, the voice of an old woman, full of sorrow. Then, out of the mist, a figure appeared. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched too long and thin for its body. Its eyes were pits of deep red, glowing faintly in the fog. It stood perfectly still, watching me with an intensity that felt almost physical. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. There was a moment, suspended in time, where the forest held its breath with me. The creature took a step forward, and the spell was broken. I turned and ran, the whispers chasing me. Louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled the woods with madness. I didn't look back, not once, not until I burst from the tree line and stumbled onto the road that led back to my house. The fog stayed at the edge of the woods, a wall of white that watched as I fled. The whispers faded with the mist, but their echoes lingered in my mind long after that night. I don't walk in the woods anymore, not since the fog came. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear it whispering to me still, calling me back to the trees. But I know better now. Some things, once disturbed, never rest again. My friends and I had always been the adventurous types, the kind who would rather spend a weekend lost in the woods than stuck inside watching TV. So, when the idea came up to go camping deep in the northern forest, no one hesitated. It was supposed to be just another weekend, filled with campfires, stories, and the peacefulness of nature. We were a group of 4, and by the time we had set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. We had found a perfect spot near a clearing, with just enough tree cover to shield us from the wind. The fire was crackling, and the smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air. It was the sort of night that felt like it could go on forever. But as the darkness deepened, so did an unspoken tension. Maybe it was the way the shadows danced a little too wildly around the fire's edge. or how the usual nighttime sounds of the forest seemed muffled, as if something was waiting in silence. Deciding we needed more wood to keep the fire going through the night, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the trees. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. The forest seemed different at night, more alive and somehow watching. I had walked farther than I intended, my thoughts caught up in the strange atmosphere, when I realized the silence had become oppressive. The usual chirping of crickets or the distant call of nocturnal animals was absent. It was just silence, thick and heavy. Then I saw them, two glowing red eyes, low to the ground among the bushes. At first I froze, thinking it might be a deer or some small animal caught in my flashlight beam. But as my light flickered, the eyes didn't disappear. They grew larger, closer, with each passing second. I could see now that they were set in a large, hulking form, covered in matted fur that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The creature had an unsettling presence, and it moved with a deliberate, stalking grace that no normal animal possessed. I should have run, screamed, done anything but what I did next. I stared back, transfixed by those burning eyes. It was as if the creature was peering straight into my soul, reading my fears, my thoughts. Then, a snap of a twig nearby broke the spell, and I realized the danger I was in. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the creature, until I was far enough to turn and sprint back to the camp. I burst into the clearing, out of breath, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends saw the terror on my face and gathered around, but all I could do was point towards the darkness where I had come from. We packed up with shaking hands, abandoning our gear and half-cooked food, and left the campsite that night. Back in the safety of our car, as we drove away, I looked back at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw a pair of red eyes watching us from the tree line, but then they disappeared, swallowed by the night. We never talked about going back, and we never camped in that forest again. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination, and it wasn't any animal I know. It was something else, something that belonged deep in the darkness of the woods, where human eyes aren't meant to see. I'm a wildlife photographer, which means my work often leads me into the deeper, less traveled parts of the forest. I thrive on capturing nature in its rawest forms, the untamed beauty of the wilderness that few get to see. This particular venture took me to a remote area, known locally as the Grove of Whispers. It was rumored to be an ancient part of the forest, where the trees were said to be alive with spirits. I was skeptical, of course. I had encountered many haunted locations and come away with nothing but beautiful photos. This time, however, I was seeking the elusive Ghost Orchid, rumored to bloom there under the light of the full moon. As night fell, the forest transformed. The air grew thick with mist, and the moon cast an ethereal glow over everything, turning the woods into a landscape from a dream. With my camera ready, I ventured into the heart of the grove. The deeper I went, the more I felt an unshakable feeling of being followed. Every rustle in the underbrush seemed deliberate. Every shadow cast by the moonlight seemed to shift and watch me. Focused on my task, I found the orchids, their pale petals almost translucent in the moonlight, and began setting up for the perfect shot. That's when I felt it, a palpable shift in the air, a sudden drop in temperature. I turned, camera in hand, and saw it. The creature was like nothing I had ever encountered. It stood on the edge of the clearing, tall and covered in what looked like a cloak of moss and vines. Its eyes were like deep, dark pools, reflecting the moonlight. It didn't move aggressively. Instead, it watched me with a curious, almost intelligent tilt of its head. I slowly raised my camera, half out of instinct and half in a gamble that I wouldn't provoke it. The creature stayed still, as if allowing me to capture its image. When I looked from my camera, it was closer, and I could see now that it wasn't just covered in plants. It seemed to be part of the forest itself, branches and leaves interwoven into its being. I took a step back, my heart racing, but it simply turned, walking slowly back into the woods, each step deliberate and silent. I followed at a distance, driven by a mix of fear and fascination. It led me through the forest, and I noticed the wildlife seemed unbothered by its presence. Frogs continued their chorus. Owls watched from their perches, undisturbed. Finally, it stopped at a small pond, the waters clear and still under the moonlight. It turned to me one last time, then stepped into the pond, disappearing without a ripple, as if it had never been there at all. I left the grove that night with a profound sense of wonder and a memory card full of what I knew would be unbelievable shots. When I developed the photos, however, where the creature should have been, there was only the grove, untouched and serene, as if the entity was a figment of my imagination, leaving me to wonder if what I had seen was real or just another spirit of the forest, revealing itself to a lone traveler in the night. I'm an amateur herpetologist, mainly studying amphibians in their natural habitats. One of my favorite places to explore and collect samples is around Moon Lake, deep within a secluded part of the forest. The lake is so named because of how perfectly the moon reflects on its surface on clear nights, creating a picturesque scene straight out of a fairy tale. However, local legends warn of the Whisperer of Moon Lake, a creature said to inhabit the waters, protecting them from intruders. I've always chalked these stories up to folk tales designed to keep the curious away from a dangerous, remote area. One evening, I set up near the lake to record nocturnal frog calls. The night was particularly serene, with a full moon casting an almost daylight-like glow over everything. As the night progressed, I noticed a decrease in the usual cacophony of frog calls, an eerie silence gradually taken over. It was unusual, but I thought little of it, attributing the quiet to a potential predator in the vicinity, perhaps a fox or a raccoon. As I adjusted my equipment, I felt a slight, cool breeze ripple across the lake, carrying with it a soft, almost melodious whisper. I looked up, scanning the area, but saw nothing that could explain the sound. Thinking it was just the wind, I returned to my work. But then it came again, louder this time, a clear and unmistakable whisper calling out from the lake. Leave. Chills ran down my spine. I stood frozen, not in fear, but in an attempt to rationalize the voice. It was then I saw it, a figure emerging from the mist that had begun to gather over the lake. It was draped in a veil of water droplets, each reflecting the moonlight, creating an effect as though it was woven from the night sky itself. The figure had a graceful, almost regal presence, moving towards me with an effortless glide across the water surface. I could not move, nor did I want to. My curiosity had morphed into awe as the figure neared. It was humanoid, but possessed an ethereal quality, with eyes that shone with a deep, sorrowful understanding of the natural world. It stopped just short of the shore, standing atop the water as if it were solid ground. "Why do you disturb the silence?" it asked, its voice like the flow of water, smooth and undulating. Gathering my courage, I answered, explaining my study and my fascination with the natural world. The creature listened, its expression unreadable, then slowly nodded. "Respect these waters and their inhabitants, and you may return," it said before turning, gliding back across the lake and disappearing into the mist from which it had emerged. The frog calls resumed, louder than before, as if nothing had happened. I packed up my equipment, my mind racing with questions. Was I granted permission by the guardian of Moon Lake? Had I imagined the encounter due to isolation and the late hour? I've returned many times since that night, always respectful, always listening. I haven't seen the Whisperer again, but sometimes, when the moon is just right, I swear I hear a soft whisper in the breeze, a gentle reminder of the balance between our world and those we barely understand. I'm no stranger to rough terrain or isolated trails. As a park ranger, I've spent more time among trees than in cities. So when locals started whispering about strange occurrences in Black Pine Pass, a seldom hiked part of the national forest, I was tasked with checking it out. Most assumed it was just bears getting too close to the trails, but the recent disappearance of a hiker had everyone on edge. Equipped with my standard gear and a bit of unease, I started my patrol early in the morning. The forest in this area was denser, older, and had a reputation for being unnavigable. The pines towered overhead, their thick branches blocking out most of the light, casting the ground into perpetual twilight. It was silent, eerily so. No birds chirping, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath. As I made my way deeper into the pass, the air grew unnaturally cold. I noticed frost on the ground, which was odd since it was midsummer. Then came the fog, rolling in thick waves that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I pressed on, relying on my GPS to guide me. That's when I first heard the whispers. They were soft, almost drowned out by the sound of my own breathing, but definitely there. I stopped, listening, trying to make out words or a direction they might be coming from, but they were formless, just whispers on the wind. My skin crawled with the realization that this might not be a standard patrol. I continued, each step feeling more labored than the last, as if I were walking through water. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, now accompanied by shadows, moving just at the edge of my vision. I tried to focus on the path, but the shadows grew bolder, circling around me, darting in and out of the fog. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing, and there it stood, a figure, cloaked in darkness, almost blending into the shadows, but for its unnaturally glowing eyes. It was tall, its silhouette humanoid, but distorted, with elongated limbs that seemed to twitch and jerk unnaturally. It stared at me, and I felt a chill deeper than the cold air could account for. I don't scare easily, but every instinct screamed at me to flee. However, my duty held me there. I took out my camera, hoping to document what I saw. As I raised it, the creature cocked its head, as if curious. I snapped a picture, and in the flash, it vanished. Shaken, I hurried back to my station, the whispers and shadows following me until I left the pass. The photo revealed nothing but the empty clearing, the creature gone as if it had never existed. I reported my findings, suggesting that the area be closed off until further investigation could be conducted. The disappearance remained unsolved, and Black Pine Pass was eventually deemed unsafe for hikers. Though I continue my work as a ranger, I avoid that part of the forest. Some things in nature, I've learned, are beyond our understanding, meant to remain undisturbed and respected from a distance.